red-blue teaming that we're going to have to do here between having agents that are scouring code bases, looking for exploits, looking for buffer overflows, looking for SQL injection stuff across wide swaths of applications, and then the red teaming that's going on there of people trying to penetrate into your applications it's going to be another level.
Welcome to the / podcast, where we lean into the future of IT by inviting fellow thought leaders, innovators, and problem solvers to slash through its complexity. I'm your host, James Carman, and today we're talking to Matt McDole. Matt McDole is the global CTO at Yum Brands, where he leads global platform and e-commerce engineering for iconic brands, including KFC, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and Habit Burger and Grill. I've not got to try that one yet. I need to get to find one of those. Yeah, I've heard it's good, but I don't know where to find one. Since joining Yum in 2020, he has helped scale and modernize the company's digital and mobile platforms to support millions of customers worldwide. With more than 15 years of experience across e-commerce, mobile, fintech, and healthcare, Matt has built and led high-performing engineering teams while driving large-scale technology transformation. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from the University of Central Missouri. Welcome to the / Matt.
Yeah, thanks, James. I'm happy to be here. I'm really excited.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. I was really excited to have you on because we kind of share a little bit of our background and our experience. I, too, was in the leadership program and leadership team at Pizza Hut. Yeah, it's kind of a rags to riches story, really. I started out as a lowly delivery driver, and I worked my way all the way up to a shift manager. And that's, if you probably know this, that's right underneath store manager.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's pretty high up there. You may already know this. I don't know. But one Friday night, I was a shift I was managing, under my leadership, the team of, I think it was 3, maybe 4 delivery drivers. We had a 100% on-time delivery on a Friday night.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's kind of unheard of. I'm sure you all still speak of it to this day. It probably reaches up to your level.
I think I've heard your name echoed in the hallways. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I assume that's why you wanted to come on the show,
exactly.
just to finally meet. Yeah. I've got some headshots I've put together with some signatures. If you'd like to maybe share with your team,
okay.
I'm sure they would love it.
Okay.
But we can do that later. Enough about me and all of my accolades. You're kind of a big deal too. So let's maybe get into that. It's funny because a lot of people, when you mention Yum Brands, people don't know Yum, but they absolutely are going to know all of the things that Yum owns, like KFC, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut. Everybody knows that stuff. But, I live here in Kentucky, so KFC is dear to our heart here. And, you have a big presence down in Louisville, Kentucky, or Louisville, as we say here in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I've been corrected many times.
Do you get to spend much time here in Kentucky?
Yeah, I go there a few times a year. Yeah, because we have a decent engineering team there.
Okay, yeah, it's a great town, Louisville. You mentioned you've done a lot of different stuff: e-commerce, mobile, fintech, healthcare. Tell us a little bit about your background in healthcare. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so I worked at Express Scripts, which is a pharmacy benefit manager company, and it's quite large. And while I worked there, we got acquired by Cigna, which is like a Fortune 10 healthcare company. It's massive.
Mm-hmm.
And my time there, I spent sort of standing up the mobile division. They had at the time kind of what I would call like a legacy sort of hybrid application that hadn't been updated in quite some time, and they wanted like a new, fresh looking native sort of mobile experience. So to do that, we kind of built the team, then we built service teams that built the APIs to support it, because we wanted like a new sort of clean backend for front end service. Because, as you go into the sort of back end of these large healthcare companies, it's almost like you have to be an archaeologist to go through all the different layers that exist across them. And we wanted to have some clean foundations to build a mobile app off of. And that kind of eventually grew into helping lead the mobile division. I think at our peak, we maybe had sort of 7 apps across various companies, and we became sort of the center that did that. And it was was a really cool time. We got to work out of an incubator space in St. Louis at the headquarter office. We actually got like a carved out space. That was that kind of shows you like how serious they were kind of taking this new replatforming. But we were all sort of crammed in that incubator space, and it was a really really fun time in my career.
So does your career kind of follow the, when you have a computer science degree, did you do a lot of the software engineering part, or were you one of those just jumping straight into leadership? What was that arc like for you?
There's different archetypes of engineering leader. And as I go to different companies, there are some engineering leaders that I would just sort of call more pure management, or people leadership. And then there are those that are sort of on the other end of the pendulum that's more strongly technical. I am definitely on that other end of the pendulum. So even at Express Scripts at that time, I was doing a lot of architecture, a lot of design. I had started as a principal engineer at that company. Even now, through my career at Yum, I've sort of continued on that journey to the degree that I can, with time constraints that are demanded of me. But I still consider myself sort of leading from the front.
Nice. Now, do you have to do like the kind of undercover boss thing, like put on like a fake mustache or something to be able to, pull a story and start working on some code, or what?
Yeah, I'm actually usually really jealous of our teams. Like whenever they get some fun problem, I'm like, oh man, I wish I could go do this, and then I proceed to enter a budget meeting or a finance meeting or something like that afterwards. But yeah, no. Today, the closest that I get to code at the job is either doing POCs, to prove things out, and where it then gets handed off to real engineers, or it's to do high level architecture and design. But that's the extent of it these days.
And that's one of the reasons I still love just, jumping in and doing some code is, we grow up as technologists getting, you have those rapid feedback loops, right? And you run your
Yeah,
tests and you see green stuff. That's great,
yeah,
right? You get that rapid feedback. But in leadership, it's a long tail of before you'll get any feedback on a lot of the decisions you make, and it's tough. And so it is kind of, it's like a dopamine hit or
yeah. You
something, I
miss that
guess.
dopamine hit. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So do you get to do much, coding on the side? Like, have you experimented around with the AI stuff? I know a lot of leaders are doing that now and tinkering. How's your experience there?
Yeah, I mean, even before the AI tooling dropped, I still did a decent bit of like open source coding. I have a few popular sort of open source projects under, semi-popular under my name on GitHub. But
Nice.
with the sort of rise of the new crop of tooling, maybe starting with like Cursor and Windsurf, and now kind of going into Claude Code and Codex, because I'm time constrained a lot, it's allowed me to kind of step back into it in a way that I think would have been difficult without it. And I don't think I have been more productive in my hobby coding than like the past 6 or 7 months versus like the past like 2 or 3 years. So that's been rewarding for me from a personal perspective, just because I've had to step out of the day to day coding more and more at the job, being able to at nighttime still make some progress, in between taking kids to soccer skills training or things like that. Is I
Yeah.
still could get some stuff done.
I think, because I guess, you and I are probably around the same, uh, you know, level of like getting to do coding these days, and we're kind of hobbyist level.
Yeah.
Do you think our experience, because my experience has been the same, it's been very refreshing to me of like, I might have these little side projects, and, when you sit down on a Saturday morning, you got a cup of coffee, and you're like, oh man, it's going to take me an hour to get back into this, blah, blah. I think all of that kind of has gone away. I can just jump right back into things quicker. It's definitely made my experience better. Um, what do you think about like the day-to-day folks, the people, this is their day job, this is what they do day in and day out. There's a whole slew of things that developers do on a day, and it's not just about slinging code.
Yeah.
What are some of those other areas where you kind of had, surprises where like, oh wow, this actually works really well for this use case too?
Yeah. One of the things, that I think about a lot is, our devs have like on-call rotation, on-call schedule. And we have incident commanders that get spun up if there's an issue. We kind of pass around this virtual pager, and I'm seeing like a pretty decent benefit in during incidents for engineering teams to be able to sort of diagnose and debug issues that are kind of afflicting them. And one example, there was a story maybe 6 months ago where an incident got called, and engineers and the SRE team got paged because people were attempting to add a product to their cart for Pizza Hut. And this product had time availability on it, where it was only supposed to be available during a certain time. And as people were trying to add to their cart, it wasn't adding, even though we were within that time window. And, if they attempted to add it, it would say it's not available yet. And then after 15 minutes, it then would allow it to be added. But it was like 15 minutes after when we would expect. We have this library internally called Ocarina. That's like our time-based availability library. It's a Golang library that we have that is like doing all these time span calculations. This is like just such a fraught space. I think we probably have more unit tests on that library than probably any other library in the system. So my initial instinct was this has got to be another Ocarina bug, right? That we've encountered. So I joined the incident call, and I'm not incident commander on this call, so I'm just kind of in the background being silent. But I was kind of trying to poke around, seeing if I could find anything just in the background while I'm not disturbing anybody. So I cloned the Ocarina library to my laptop, and I described the sort of bug that we're seeing in production. And I just said, is there anything in the Ocarina library that looks like it might contribute to this? And I was using Claude Code at the time. And it churned for like 2.5 minutes. And it said that it saw nothing that would introduce that behavior. But it then said it could be in the calling code, right? And the calling code for Ocarina for us is the cart service. So I said, okay. So I cloned the cart service directly inside the Ocarina folder because I didn't want to add, I wanted it in the sort of allowed directory that I had. And I said, all right, I've added the calling code into this directory here. Let's look through it. And it churned for 4.5 minutes. And then it said, found it. I found where there could be an issue that's sort of an edge case for whenever you have these sort of overlapping time spans that could prevent you from adding a product. And then it suggested a fix. And I messaged the CTO of Pizza Hut who was on the call. And it was kind of funny. At the same time, he said, I think I found it. He said he thinks he had found the bug. And I asked him, was it line such and such in the cart service? And he said, yes. How did you know? And it was because,
I know every line.
Yeah, I was like, oh, yeah, it's really good.
Of course, I know that.
And I'm like, no, I just like had Claude Code sit here and churn over these two repos. But that was another aha moment for me. I think that was like, this is super impactful because oftentimes in these incident calls, you're trying to page the primary on call for the area. Maybe you're trying to get like somebody that's over the ordering and cart space. But at first, maybe you're going to have an SRE on that call, or you're going to have somebody from an adjacent domain that's not in that domain. And you're trying to get the correct people to come up. But being able to provide context to those people whenever they come in, have people that sit outside that domain be able to investigate an area that's maybe not even their own area, I think it is huge. I think it's going to really drive down like the MTTR, like the mean time to resolution for these issues in the future. So I thought that was like a really cool anecdote where, it kind of it honed in on this bug.
First of all, I appreciate the Legend of Zelda reference in your Ocarina. I mean, I'm a fan. That's very well done. I like that. But I mean, I guess if you take that idea, could we? I don't know. I'm just thinking through as you're talking through this. I love the idea of like having the calling service and the service that's being called together in the same context, and it's able to kind of look on both sides of that and say, this looks okay, but over here they're doing something funky. That's really cool. And I'm sure there's work being done in this area. I think I've heard about it. But like, what if we're monitoring logs and having an AI monitor logs, and then it sees things and automatically goes and does what you did itself and says, "Hey, I'm seeing a problem here." Are you guys, have you seen anybody experimenting with that idea?
I definitely think that in the SRE space, there's work being done to automatically review logs and anomalies, right? And that, like, one of the things that you can get with like anomaly logging is like alert fatigue, because you got to really dial them in. Because if they're too dialed in, then people just get tired of getting paged all the time for these alerts that end up being nothing. But if you make them too loose, then maybe you miss some critical things that occur. So having like an extra layer that like maybe sits above some of these anomaly detections can be a thing. And then in terms of like the repo thing, I have heard that there's some increased proclivity towards model repos now because it's good for the current agents, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of some startups and stuff that like have structured basically their entire company's code base in single large monolithic GitHub repositories. Now, well broken out into the various domains, but then what that allows you to do is just kind of bring AI agents into the context of the whole thing. And then if you have, sort of agents.md files or claude.md files that sort of describe the hierarchy of where everything can be, it can allow them to, traverse these different areas, these different domains. It also allows them to work on a feature that spans, the front end and the back end and do it in a cohesive way.
Mm-hmm.
So I have wondered if we're going to start to see more people, start to structure their code bases in mono repos as well.
My low tech solution for that is traditionally I've kind of, you have like, I've got an API library or, repo, and I've got a front end repo, a spa. And then I'll check. And usually the way my desktop is set up is like you just check out all the projects into one big folder, and they're all just kind of siblings of each other. But what I've started doing whenever there's like related things like that, I'll create a parent folder, and then I'll check out those the service and the spa underneath that. But then I'll fire up Claude in that parent folder, like you're saying, like so I'll have that context of both of them. And it's really cool because it kind of gives you that mono repo.
Yeah.
It's a lower tech solution for a mono repo, but I have found that that's really nice. It's like, oh, do you want me to fix the front end too?
Yeah.
Yes, I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. I do
Actually,
the same thing, right? I'll clone them all to like the same directory and then like introduce that directory to the context of Claude or Codex.
now it took me a while to pick up on that idea.
Right.
For months I was just, hey, Claude in one window,
Yes.
can you give me a spec to tell the other Claude in the other window what to do, please? And
Yeah.
and then I finally aha moment after, I'm not real smart. It took me a while, but I figured it out finally, and then it's like, oh, this is like getting closer to nirvana for me for sure.
There's another aspect of this too that I was talking with another engineering leader the other day, and this thought about ways to thread type safe domains across your layers, like your front end and your back end, and then your sort of data layer. So, like he had mentioned that they use something called TRPC to kind of create this sort of type safe API and then all the domain objects that span all of them. And I think that's going to be another thing. Like type safety is ended up being like a really strong benefit to agentic tooling because it gets that feedback loop really quickly about if it's broken something or if something has changed. And if you can have the same types and domains in some fashion, TRPC might be one way, or maybe there's other ways to do it as well that permeate all these layers where if you're changing one, you're changing another, and you can kind of share the base domain objects. I think that ends up being like an enabler for AI coding as well.
Yeah, those like shared models and shared language kind of thing that goes across those are
Yeah.
very hard.
Yeah.
Even with a mono repo, you're still at the mercy of synchronized deployments,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, I deployed the service and it changed the or added a field, but I got to do that first, and then I can do the UI and all of those sort of things. Still got to worry about that with even with mono. But
Yeah.
yes, it does make it much easier to make sure you're covering everything that needs to be covered for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things I am seeing, and I don't know if you guys have a lot of this, you seem like, you're very tech forward, and there's probably not a lot of like these legacy code bases that one of those like that sits around for 20 years that nobody touches, nobody knows how it works, but there are businesses out there that are like that. I have heard some of the folks in the industry talking about like, well, we don't need to keep the person who's been employed here for 45 years that is the only person that knows this code base, and we can actually use AI if there is something that happens that goes bump in the night. We turn AI loose on that. It's COBOL sometimes, or
Mm-hmm.
it's maybe even assembler, but they'll have the AI look and say just same thing you did. Is there anything in this code base that could contribute to this is what we're experiencing? And it actually does a really good job, and they're able to find their way through those things. And we don't need that person. And I'm sure that person wants to retire too. You know what I mean? Like they're getting to that age, but we don't need to keep those folks around. That tribal knowledge is not the only way we can fix these problems anymore. AI has been pretty beneficial. Are you guys having, I mean, you're already having it on new code bases, but do you have that sort of other problem as well?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, any enterprise I think has, probably a mix of legacy, older code, and then sort of more greenfield new code, and has to contend with it. Um, I, I do think that, well, first off, if we just take like those, graybeards, right, that have been there a long time, they're still immensely valuable. And but what I do think AI coding can allow, perhaps, is to just make them not necessarily the bottleneck, or to free them up, so that way they can even apply their knowledge in more useful ways. Um, I have found the AI coding to be really amazing at helping us document,
Mm,
legacy code bases. I do think whenever you're using AI coding to edit or affect change in code bases, the benefit gets less the more legacy and the larger the code base is. And I'm not saying that there's no benefit. I'm saying there's still benefit. But like if you have like a greenfield project or a really well structured new code base, I think that the AI coding is most impactful there, where it's
mhm,
able to do the most. Whenever you're dealing with very large legacy code bases, it is AI coding is amazing for having it sort of drill in and ask questions about it and try to discover things that, maybe you don't have enough coverage on this old code base, or like you said, somebody does retire and it's still something you need to maintain. um, but then whenever it goes to like actually making the changes in these legacy code bases, this is where I think we just need to be the most careful, because you know that sort of double-edged sword of like where the AI coding is like really good and where it can sometimes fall down is, it sometimes will, I'm sure you've seen this, like kind of reinvent the wheel of something. Like if there's, for example, an enum and a system like a auth system, authorization system that already exists in a code base,
mhm,
and then it gets a task to implement, an authorization task. You sometimes have the issue where it might locally create like an authorization system in in an area when there already exists one, because it doesn't have that global context.
mhm,
And the larger the code base that there is, the more that I think that this can impact it. And in some ways, I think it's an engineering problem and something that's going to continue to get better over time. But this is one of those areas where it's like you have to be pretty fastidious to make sure that like it's not sort of reinventing the wheel in an existing large code base and things like that. So I think it's both, can help on both sides. But I think it's really impactful if you're trying to just document those old code bases or answer questions. Well, I think one of the things I had heard that we're still kind of grappling with a little bit is like for a long time, if you'd look in Slack, there'd be a bunch of junior engineers, new hires on onboarding, asking a ton of questions about like, hey, why does this work like this? Why does this do like this? And those conversations happen, but they're a lot less frequent, because I think now junior engineers are just kind of asking this infinitely patient, sort of agent or oracle that's, that they have pointed at the code base, and it's answering the bulk of their questions. I think this is
mhm,
good in some ways, and it is a double-edged sword, but good in that, maybe it frees up the time of that senior engineer, that, they're only answering the high value questions. That's like maybe not how does this work, but why does it work this way? Something
mhm.
that maybe the coding agent can't answer. So yeah, I think we see some of that as well.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some like weird side edge cases of like benefits that we didn't even foresee. But I absolutely with more junior folks, because we've all been there. We were all juniors at one time. You kind of feel embarrassed to ask a question sometime. I don't feel embarrassed to ask Claude, right? Like
Right.
I can ask a computer. It's not going to be, what are you, an idiot? It's not going to do that to you. So you'll ask those questions, and maybe you would ask them earlier and not spin your wheels so long. Where I like people to try to figure things out on their own. Yes.
Yeah.
So there's kind of that sweet spot of
Yeah.
like, don't just ask the question immediately of
Right.
Claude. Try to figure it
Yeah.
out. But I think they'll accelerate. Their growth will come faster for them than where they had to depend on and be apprehensive about coming and asking one of us pretentious old graybeards like me that are going to be
Yeah.
like, "What are you, an idiot?"
Yeah.
No, I don't do that. But that was my experience that would happen if when you ask a silly question or
Right.
you didn't
Right.
think it was
Yeah.
silly.
Or
There
yeah.
was always that apprehension of like,
Yeah.
oh man, they're going to think I'm an idiot. But
Yeah,
yeah.
it's the
Anyway.
same. It's the same thing with Stack Overflow, right? Like somebody
Mm,
showed like that chart of like the traffic of Stack Overflow over time, and
mm,
um, I I think at one point in time, I was in like the top 0.1% of users on Stack Overflow in the early days. I think I was in there in beta and answered some question about how do you like convert a string to lowercase or something like that. One of those like low hanging fruit questions that then ends up getting like upvoted a million times. But Stack Overflow started to have a reputation where you kind of get these like moderators in that can like aggressively close questions as duplicates, or it just kind of makes it like an unwelcoming place
Mhm.
at times, right? An unwelcoming vibe if you're trying to learn and ask questions. And now people, like you said, they can just go. Nobody's embarrassed to go ask Claude. If anything, Claude is gonna be like, "No, you're a genius for asking this question. Like, this
This is
is
the
a great
exact right
question."
question
Yeah,
you should be asking right
yeah,
now, and it shows that you're
yeah,
so smart. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, and the funny thing is Claude was trained on, these models were trained on Stack Overflow, so you would
yeah,
think that there might be like, "Actually,
yeah,
you asked me that question 2 months ago. I'm not gonna answer it. Go figure it out on your own." Like, yeah.
yeah, yeah. We
Yeah.
don't want a Reddit moderator training in our LLMs. I think that would be bad.
Yeah. Is their experience, you see, has that been is it different for them?
Um, yeah, one of the things that's really surprised me about the rise of this tooling is just the diversity of uptake that it's had.
Mhm.
I feel like my intuition would have been that this technology drops and that it would just permeate and be widespread and everybody using it. But I think actually, as I look across the teams, it's kind of a natural distribution curve of you have some people that have strongly adopted it and they're using, they got multiple agents running at the same time. And then you have a non-trivial cohort of people that have not stepped in it either because maybe they find it intimidating or maybe they don't like, what this is, how they perceive this kind of driving change in industry that they love, or skeptics of its efficacy. So I think it's a wide mix. I think you've got people that are just now dipping their toes in the water a little bit, and then you have some people that are just strongly adopting it in every aspect of their sort of day-to-day workflow.
Yeah. I've seen the same thing. I mean, you just, as you said, you have some people that are like, they can't have enough agents running at one time. There is no limit to them. But we've got, I mean, even some of our folks here at Liberty, we've got some folks that are kind of that no true Scotsman type of thing. Like, oh,
Yes.
no real software engineer needs AI.
Yes.
Those kind of things. The John
Yes.
Henrys of the world, right?
Yes.
Um,
Uh,
it didn't end up great for John Henry.
no,
I hope.
I used that John Henry analogy with my team the other day, and then I felt old because nobody knew who John
Like,
Henry
what are
was.
you
So I was
talking
like,
about? Okay, so I'm in good company because I've had the same thing happen to me. But it is interesting, and the particular person I'm thinking about. I mean, they're advanced technology. They're really good. I mean, it's kind of surprising that the people who gravitate at least to me, it's just been weird, and I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to it of how people fall out on that bell curve.
yeah,
But
I
it's
don't think
weird.
it's like a correlation to skill, right?
No.
I think some of the people that are on that left side of the either skeptics or not strongly adopters, a few of them I would call some of my best engineers.
Hmm.
And then likewise, all up and down that gamut. So yeah, it's very interesting how people have sort of perceived this and how that is not correlated.
I mean, it's funny. I heard somebody mention the other day that we're in the post-truth era because everything's fake. There's videos and all that. It's hard to know. Like you have some people saying, "Oh, we're never going to have developers again," and then you have some people. I think that last year we talked about in the prep call the METR study that
Yeah,
talked about like people were actually less productive with
right, right,
with
right.
AI. I think the scope of that study was early 2025, but I feel like something's changed in the latter part of 2025. You've had that same kind of perception. I think it seems like a lot of people will feel that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, first off, to the no developers anymore. I think there's a lot of hyperbole and hype, right, that flows around that actually does a large disservice to like the real value that people get out of these tools, right? So like, I think it turns some of those people off from using them because they can sense the hype and the untruth in those statements. But if there is real tangible benefit out of these tools, that is sort of like hiding it a little bit.
Hmm.
In terms of like the narrative changing, about 3 years ago, we did an internal study at Yum on the current crop of AI tooling, 2.5, 3 years ago or so. Like whenever it was like first kicking off, ChatGPT kicked off, and then there was like an early wave of AI coding tooling tools. Amazon had an early one. The early iterations of Copilot with its sort of autocomplete capability,
Hmm.
but none of these had any agentic ability or editing in them. They were really kind of like glorified, souped up autocompletes for the most part. And we did a study. I think we rolled it out to 30 or 40 devs. We got licenses, and we had them use each one of these tools for a week. And then at the end, we tried to measure some Dora metrics, and then we took some qualitative feedback from them as well. And our conclusion at that time was that the tooling was immature. There was a minor benefit, but it was like not super strong. Um,
Hmm.
so, and in the background, we were still kind of getting asked a lot about, hey, what about this AI stuff? How is this improving devs and stuff? And that this was sort of our attempt to answer that. And the answer that was kind of coming back was like minor improvement for them. Like again, wasn't really matching up to the hype that everybody was hearing. So if either we had senior executives or anything like asking us about what's happening during that time, I think that was like surprising people. But there was at some point um, early last year, whenever Cursor hit, um, people started to, I think, see something a little bit there where, now finally, in the early days of Cursor, you had to at tag any file. You kind of still manage your context a lot. And the scope of change that you would make would be to a specific file. It was essentially like a file editor for you. You would describe the change and then it would make the edits to that file. And then Windsurf came out, and Windsurf's big thing was that like you no longer had to manually at tag in files. You describe what you wanted to do, and it would pull in, different files into the context as needed, and then potentially edit one or more files in this sort of new agentic style. And then that felt like a paradigm shift a little bit. But then about mid-year last year, maybe a little bit earlier, Claude Code started to come out. And I was trying to remember I think there was like a Steve Yigi or somebody had called it like a wood chipper that you feed $20 bills into, and out comes like like productive changes across this code base. That was an amazing time, and that was before that they had like max plans. And I remember signing up for the API, and I was using Cloud Code then, and it was expensive because you were burning through a lot of token usage, and if you had even a semi heavy day, it was like $100 for the day in API usage. But now we all have max plans, and everybody, I don't know if it's subsidized usage or if they've sort of also made it more efficient, or maybe both. But it's much more reasonable where you can spend maybe $100 or $200 for the month and get this. What I would view is actually quite a dramatic improvement in the developer experience.
Yeah, I that's been my experience as well. I mean, like that $200 I spend a month. I
Yeah,
would gladly, and even as
yeah,
my kind of hobbyist level that I do
yeah,
now, like gladly. I mean,
yeah.
it is so much. I am so much more productive. It's just ridiculous. So it's well worth the $200 to me.
One thing, James, too, you'd mentioned the meter study, and that gets referenced a lot. And that meter study, there was a study that came out that said that developers perceive that they were maybe be faster, but whenever they actually measured them, that they were actually something like 16% slower or something. I don't remember the exact
Hmm.
result, or something like that.
Right.
And I actually read through the study afterwards because it just didn't mirror my experience with the tooling. And I was like, I wonder what their methodology was, or if it was different. And whenever I read the study, something that stood out to me was that for everybody but one person in that study, as far as I know, this was the first time they had ever used AI tooling. And for me, that has to be a strong contributing impact. This is a kind of a new skill set that you have to learn the sort of pitfalls of and the strengths of, and like where you can use it. And the one person in that study that had used it before actually did show a dramatic improvement. So I know that meter study gets dropped a lot, but I'm not sure that conclusion actually shows the true conclusion of agentic tooling and like the improvement that people get from it.
Yeah, I mean, if you have, a bunch of people go out and shoot basketballs and they've never picked up a basketball in their life, but then you got one guy who's been playing, for 5 years, they're going to
Yeah.
have a better outcome. But you can't. Yeah, yeah. It's kind of a silly thing to throw out there and just make this be proof for, oh, this AI thing's not going to work. I mean, it's just at the individual level, if you're not more productive with AI, you're doing something wrong. I mean, you know what I mean? I just feel like that. Now I can see, here's the thing that I have seen, and I'm curious how you guys, what your experience has been at Yum, but we hear a lot of leaders saying, yes, we are improving the developers. There's a there with the individual developers and the teams. They're faster, but overall, our organization, we're just not seeing a big uptick, right? Like
Mhm.
we're not getting the big benefits of this AI thing organizationally. What do you think's behind that?
Yeah, I mean, this is like the classic engineering problem where you remove one bottleneck,
Mhm,
but then it immediately shows what like maybe another organizational bottleneck is. And I think that could be true. I think even with that, I would be. Just was really shocking to me for people to not still see some amount of dramatic speed up. Now, if teams have large planning cycles, and there's all the other functions that you have in an organization and that whole process for how they interact, I absolutely could see that, like, maybe the developers are feeling like their stuff is faster, but a senior leader is not seeing something that ships materially faster. I could see something like that.
mhm,
Internally within Yum, I'd mentioned that early pilot that we did where we didn't see a lot of speed up. This past year, we've done a new pilot where we've brought in Cursor and Claude Code first to 100 developers. And now this year it's leaving pilot and we're rolling that out company wide, where we're going to give every developer that wants it Cursor or Claude Code across the enterprise. Um, but we have a new sort of pilot, and this new pilot now, post that rollout, is like a cross-functional team pilot. So we have one team that's building a new product within Yum, and we're calling them like an AI native team, and we're going to trial a new tooling across the whole stack. So, product is using Notion to help write specs, and then to have a spec repository, and then they're using a tool called Linear in order to have sort of like a task list, and then use AI in both of these products to help them both write the specs and distill them into their linear task list. UX is using, I think, Figma AI, and then we're using Maestro for Android-based automated testing, and then we're using AI to help write the Maestro tests. So across product, UX, engineering, and QE, we're trying to give them the best-in-class tools, and kind of, I think, to attempt to see, can we remove those other bottlenecks, and actually see a bigger material improvement, like, for the organization, not just for a single function.
it is an interesting pattern. It seems like we started with the teams, the developers, which seems like where we always start, and we always have to make them faster. But then now we're moving kind of upstream, seems to be the primary direction everybody is moving right now. Well, we got to fix all the things upstream from them to get the work to the development teams faster. I don't see a lot of emphasis on. I mean, there are things going on downstream, like deployments and platform engineering and those sort of things are there's some uptake down there and downstream, but I don't see a big emphasis on that. Is that, do you feel like that's, we've already kind of optimized that, or is there not as much of a benefit downstream from the development teams? What do you think's behind that kind of pattern?
James, whenever you say downstream from the development teams, do you mean like post release or in the release process, or can you?
Yeah, I guess like once the code is done and
Mm,
from the CI/CD pipeline to deployment and care and feeding kind of the realm of the product. And again, I know it's never done, but like the post development part of the SDLC, and how do we get this stuff deployed out into our environments? How do we monitor it and all of those sort of things? I don't. I know there are some things going on, but it
yeah,
seems like the bulk of the emphasis is from the development team upstream, not going downstream. What do you think?
yeah, yeah. I think that could be true. I where I kind of see it within Yum is we have a fairly robust site reliability and engineering team, and they are pretty strong adopters of AI.
Okay.
And I'm seeing them use that to sort of build more self-service tooling, more portal tooling, and things that enable deployment. So I am seeing stronger adoption from them. But I think that's what it takes is like if you have separate teams that are kind of like your SRE team or your DevOps team, this applies to them as well. And this is just as impactful to their field as it is to, say, pure engineering teams. And if you have sort of an AI forward SRE team, I think it can be an unlock sort of downstream from the developers. And then, also downstream from whenever we write code, I'm starting to see some adoption of tooling. We're trialing two different tools for enhanced AI code review,
Mm.
which is like a downstream task. There's new AI native security scanning tools, that are starting to get integrated in that sort of SDLC and CI/CD pipelines. And I think that's only going to enhance. Like honestly, like the security implications of having these strong coding agents is quite large, and I don't think has been fully felt by the industry yet. But I think that is definitely coming. Just having this sort of semi-autonomous agent that can sit there and plug away, looking for exploits, looking for buffer overflows, looking for SQL injection stuff across wide swaths of applications. It never gets tired. The the red blue teaming that we're going to have to do here between having agents that are scouring code bases looking for the same, and then the red teaming that's going on there of people trying to penetrate into your applications is it's going to be another level. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I saw it was literally I think this morning maybe I saw a tweet. Are they still called tweets? I don't. I call them tweets. I'm old school. I saw a tweet. They were talking about like, oh, the security industry is going to get disrupted. Blah blah blah. It was talking about red teaming, and they have agents collaborating together, trying to hack into a site,
Yeah.
working collaboratively as just agents, and it's so much faster and efficient. And they're like this red teaming thing is just going to blow the doors off everything out there. So it's just
Yeah.
wild.
But then the response is going to have to be aggressive blue teaming, right? And
Hmm.
like, I think all teams that then now have software and software artifacts that are deployed are like, we're going to have a aggressive adoption of agentic tools that are pouring through our code, looking for security exploits and things like that. In some ways, maybe the industry was kind of hiding behind security by obscurity a bit, right? Because just the economics of trying to find these exploits for all these targets didn't make sense, but this has shifted the economics of that, right?
Hmm.
So now if it's way cheaper to do, now, we have to defend in a much more robust way. And I definitely think that's coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you talk about that changing the economics. I've been saying that along, like all along, like the calculus is changing, right? Like you
Yeah.
need to recalibrate your brain. Every estimate you think you know how to do, throw it out the window, and you've got to recalibrate. Um, I think that affects, obviously across every organization that has to be relearned. If we're going further upstream, so we have product, but then, product's pretty far up, but I mean, there are activities that happen even farther up from kind of where the product folks kind of get involved. How do we push the envelope and push further upstream so that the
Yeah.
organization understands the art of the possible and recalibrates? Because I think we've trained ourselves to live with kind of the throughput and the constraints. There was like a ceiling there, and
Right.
I feel like that may no longer be there. And how do we let people break through that, and then we can tackle some of the big problems where we thought were just untenable before. We couldn't even think about these problems in the past, but now it's like we can. How do we get the whole organization to kind of shake loose of that kind of old thinking? How do we do that?
I think that's a little bit of the roles of the engineering leaders and CTOs at the companies, right? These people had the benefit of probably just being like a year or two ahead of the curve of the rest of the sort of cross-functional groups, just because it sort of impacted their area first. But I think if you sit down, somebody like yourself or another CTO or engineering leader at a company, they're like, oh no, this doesn't just apply to engineering. If it can work for engineering, it's going to work for a ton of other domains. Like I recently saw the Claude integration into Excel, and that's just like a little micro example. But like seeing that thing work is amazing, and that's going to transform finance teams. Their ability to rapidly put together, modeling for projections for the next quarter and things like that. And that's very labor intensive work that goes on today, and you know that's a big thing. I I also think in terms of the economics changing and it sort of recalibrating what we think or maybe how we approach problems. I still find myself even sometimes in the mindset of like, no, this thing is going to cost us like $600,000 to do, so let's do a bunch of pre work in order to vet it, and it's kind of like wanting to measure twice and cut once a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Where instead, I feel like my mindset needs to be like, let's ship it. Let's not spend the next 6 months talking about which path is best. you know Bezos used to have that sort of one-way door, two-way door decisions, where it's like this one-way door decision is like, either something that we can't undo or is economically unviable to undo. And then a two-way door is just, he'd say, don't spend a lot of time thinking about two-way door decisions because you can just go back through. Like, so if two people are trying to choose between a tool and it's not hard to switch the tool, don't spend any time, just pick one and then go. And then if you don't like it, switch later. This has kind of shifted what were a bunch of one-way door decisions into two-way door decisions, I think, because in that way, it's like maybe we should spend less upfront time trying to do that measuring twice. And instead, let's just ship both versions. Let's just do both and then measure. Like if there's some new feature and there's an argument internally about it, like the cost of doing an A/B test now across both full iterations, even in a hobby project I did recently, there were like 3 different ways of modeling metadata for, I was creating a personal thing to host audiobooks at home, and I was listening to some of my audiobooks. And there's like this layered metadata for audiobooks. You have like the metadata that comes from the file. You have some that you've associated from like third-party API sources like Audible. And then you have what like overrides that users might want to type in over all 3 of those. And this is kind of like a hard UX problem a bit because you have like this sort of stacked layered metadata. And how do I represent it? And I kind of had 3 different ways of thinking about how I might do it. And just within a day, I had complete UI wired up for all 3. And before, I think I would have spent some time drafting and maybe doing like mock-ups or something and try to get people's feedback on which way to go and then choose the best one, because I would have felt that would have been more like a one-way door decision. I'm going to spend 3 weeks writing that layered multi-data metadata editor. But now I'm just like, no, it's so easy for me to iterate, especially whenever it comes to UI things like that. So yeah, I think I still find myself recalibrating. So
No,
yeah,
I agree. I'm laughing because I'm just reliving some of the same exact stuff in my brain of what I've done. Like I get to like that log jam state, right? Where I'm like, I gotta think about this. I gotta think about it, because it was kind of cost prohibitive to go deep down a path. And now it's just like,
yeah,
just
yeah,
and all the once I actually sit down and start coding, that's when all the learning happened anyway.
yeah.
And now you can kind of do it like you said. Let's just try all
Let's
3
just do
different
it. Yeah, let's
approaches
just do
and
all
let's
3.
take a
Yeah, the
look and
cost
see.
of it has dropped. Like
Yeah.
I would rather see all 3 and feel them and then know which one is best from that. Like
Yeah, because even if I did spend a week thinking through it with my vast brain, and then I would start coding, and I'm like, oh yeah, this sucks. That actually isn't a great way to
yeah,
do it, and
yeah,
it's just
yeah. You had
you
gone
don't need
down
to
a
do that.
dead end, right? And then yeah,
Yeah, I can do 3 dead ends all
yeah,
at the same time, but that's the learning, right? That's
yeah.
the Edison 1,000 different ways to not build a light bulb thing, right? Like
Right.
that's
Yeah, exactly.
we can do those
Yeah. We can all
all
be
at the same time.
Edisons for way cheaper now. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so are you all looking at, that we've talked about, using AI as a tool for ourselves, but, our users are now coming to expect that the products that we build now are incorporating AI. Have
Yeah.
you all, what's your experience been with that kind of starting to incorporate AI, workflows into your products?
Yeah. Yeah, I think like even 2 years ago, 2, 3 years ago, every executive across the world, it was kind of like, what is your AI strategy? Right. And
Hmm.
in many ways, I kind of feel like it was a bit of an unfair question, even though everybody had to have an answer. I feel like it was a bit of an unfair question because the technology was so nascent. It was like the real answer was like, let's let this mature a little bit and we're going to find the value use cases. But I think within, Yum, we have identified several like high value use cases that, where it makes sense. And most of those use cases are kind of around improving a few different personas of people's life. One persona it would be, for example, employees. So it running a QSR restaurant, a quick service restaurant has never been harder than it has been in 2026. Maybe 20 years ago, a restaurant only had to worry about one or two channels, drive through and front counter. Now they have DoorDash, Uber Eats. They've got kiosk orders flowing in. They have this myriad of sort of signals. They've got multiple iPads with orders coming in at them from all angles. They got delivery drivers waiting on them. It has gotten hard in a very complex business very quickly. That transition had already started with COVID, but whenever COVID hit, it just took off like a rocket, and
Oh yeah.
it's gotten really complex. Um, and this is a business is one where margins matter a lot. So for restaurant employees, store managers, you'd mentioned that you had risen in at Pizza Hut.
Way
Scheduling
up
is
there.
a very difficult task. So ordering inventory is a difficult task, and it's one of those that if you do it wrong, then if you're too conservative, then you end up having to go borrow inventory from other stores, or you're scrambling to get inventory in sort of mid cycle, or same thing with scheduling. If you don't want to underschedule, you don't want to overschedule. So that's really hard. So using AI to drive those sort of predictions about, given a lot of different constraints, rather than just using like a naive model for, like, well, okay, what did we do last week versus this week? Sort of like a rolling prediction. You can do much more sophisticated predictions around how much product you need, how much labor you might need. So that's one way. Customers, improving customers' interactions. We have very large voice AI pilots, for example, trying to have order taking in the drive-through, and experimenting with that has been a thing. And even that one has improved employees' lives in some ways because the cognitive load gets taken off of the employee a bit. We've seen that it's improved employee satisfaction from that perspective. For customers, also, in things like the mobile apps and the digital experiences, trying to drive better insights into what products they might want, surfacing better products that they might want based on their, either what's in their cart or past ordering history. So I think those are like some of the high value use cases for how we've sort of started to roll out AI. We're also looking, in the future at continuing to improve the above store employees, people that are, doing all the data management for menus. And, it used to be that maybe a new menu would deploy, once a quarter or something like that. But now menus are updating it sometimes daily. And there's a team of people that have to maintain and make sure all those menus are in sync across thousands of stores. So trying to find ways to do that, trying to find ways to surface insights across the stores, I think are going to be some like low hanging, high value fruit for the company.
All right, I have so many questions because I did work in these stores, and you mentioned something about above store man. I mean, I thought that was the pinnacle of success. I thought I was there. I was
Yeah,
almost there. I
yeah,
mean, it was like
you're almost
right.
there. Yeah,
I didn't realize. Okay,
yeah,
I thought all the store managers basically reported straight to you.
yeah. No, no.
There's some in between.
There's definitely people in between.
Okay. Well, my perception of my history is it's my whole life is a lie. Okay. Um, the there's some interesting ones that you brought up. So the voice thing, the Taco Bell.
Yeah.
I got to hear more about. Is this like the drive-through? Like I'm talking to an AI and it's kind of taking my order. Is that am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, yeah. Yum has a couple voice AI pilots and drive-throughs across a couple different countries. But yeah, the idea is that you can drive up through a drive-through, and then there'll be sort of like a voice AI system in the drive-through that will take your order.
All right. So I got to ask. Taco Bell is
Mhm.
open until like 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in a lot of places, right? I mean, so
Yeah,
you know that the crowd is a little rough after
yeah.
midnight. They're probably leaving some party, fun times, and so they probably had a few drinks. Did you have to like calibrate the voice stuff to be able to understand like slurred speech? I mean, this is just
That's a good
fascinating.
idea. Yeah, that's a good idea for a fine-tuned model. I actually don't know. I'm sure the seasoned store managers know when to turn this on and when not to. So if they have times of the day that it's like maybe we shouldn't put the robots in right now. Yeah.
And did you? I get like different areas have different accents and whatnot. Is it that's got to be just a fascinating thing to try to to code for and to try to account for, especially if you're rolling out like the same model across the country. That's fascinating. That would be a really interesting use case, I would imagine.
Yeah, one of these one of these AI areas that is kind of unsung. The LLMs get a lot of the attention, but the ASR or speech to text models have just been improving at such a dramatic clip. It's really amazing. NVIDIA recently launched a new speech model called Parakeet 0.6 billion streaming voice AI model, ASR model. And this thing is phenomenal. It's crazy. It's so small that you could run it on your CPU of your laptop. You could run it on your MacBook. You don't even need a GPU for it
Wow.
if you didn't want to. Now, obviously, you could deploy it to a GPU, and you could run hundreds of instances of it on one of these large GPUs that are out there. But it is so accurate. Early ASR models that weren't sort of fine tuned for our use case, for example, would struggle on words like quesadilla, right? Because maybe they were trained on primarily English text or things like that. And what you would see come out of the ASR would be case a deal, case space a space deal, right?
Yeah.
And it wouldn't do quesadilla or things like Dorito, right? That are sort of a Dorito taco. I want a Dorito taco, but Dorito might not be in its sort of training loop. They handle these effortlessly now. So that to me is like a really big step change in the technology that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my iPhone, and I still have a hard time. I'm hoping that they can roll out this
Yeah,
to,
man. They got to get their stuff together. I don't know what's
I
going
don't
on.
feel like I have an accent. I mean, I know my family does. My family's from Tennessee. I've got people in
Hmm.
my family with thick accents, but I don't feel like
Right.
I have an accent. Not
Yeah.
a terrible one. The other question I would have is, because I do have experience in leadership in quick service restaurants, mostly in the Delco, as they said in the Pizza Hut delivery carryout. But it was an interesting thing. Like, I'm wondering how AI can help here. We would just know certain events in town, that the store manager would know I need to stock up on certain ingredients, certain demographics, like certain types of pizza versus others. Um, and they would just buy more, and they would even prep, let's say, more meat lovers pizzas that day, because they know that there's an event in town this just happens every year, and they would know. How are you kind of localizing that AI to take those sort of things into account, or are you? Is that just kind of we just still have to have that human in the loop to know about the local scene?
Yeah, I don't want to diminish the local human in the loop, because if we look at like across like a cohort of stores, like there will obviously be a distribution curve of different store managers and performance, even sort of normalizing for throughput and volume and things like that. And there are just some store managers that are amazing. They know their markets better than anybody. They've been at those stores for 15 years. They know if there's if it's in the UK, if there's a football match that that's happening, that they need to override the projections
Hmm.
and actually order more. KFC is kind of a unique business because some businesses are like make the food just in time, but for KFC, if you're trying to make the food when you need it, like you're not going to be ready. You have to prep the chicken a little bit ahead of time for the customers coming in, and that's actually a pretty challenging operations problem, because if you're off, then people are waiting, or you can't hit all the sales that you would want to. Um, so I know I was traveling out to the UK, and I met a store manager out there that was one of the highest performers in the UK, and just everything he knew about the store was blowing me away. I think we do have ideas around trying to drive insights in the store around things like this is like a common industry term, not just in QSR, but next best action.
Hmm.
Like how can we kind of train a model that knows more about the store and its operations and all the inputs and stuff that are going into it, and help be sort of like the rising tide that lifts all boats, that, can make all stores kind of operate like some of those very high performing stores, because they have something that tells them, hey, like right now, what is the next best action that this store should do?
Hmm.
What's, given everything that we have, and I think not just in QSR, that's going to be a thing that kind of happens across a number of industries. What is the next best action that I need to do in my restaurant and my store and my business, I definitely think things are kind of moving there.
Special thanks to our very special guest today. We've had a wonderful conversation thus far, but you're in for a real treat. It's our first ever 2-part episode of the Forward Slash. We're going to take a break. We'll see you on the next episode. Be sure to tune in. The Forward Slash podcast is created by Calibrity. The Forward Slash team is director and producer Ryan Wilson, editing by Steve Baradelli, marketing support by Taylor Blessing, and I'm your host, James Carman. Thanks for listening.